Hello, welcome. I'm Dr. Stoddard. Today we're going to be talking about SPSS, Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. We're going to be working within version 23, but keep in mind that many of these commands and the display is very similar to past versions and hopefully will be similar to future versions. So this should give you a basic overview and introduction of the software. Many people get very scared, have a lot of apprehension, fear, nerves, and stress when dealing with statistics, research methodology, and particularly the software packages that come with it. However, SPSS is a very nice software package. It's become very user-friendly over the years. In addition, it does much of the statistical calculations, the math essentially, behind the research. So it doesn't put as much on the plate of the researcher. It doesn't require as much mathematical calculations. We do need to be thinking forward about how we're going to use the software and designing studies correctly. However, this is going to do a lot of the actual math work. So it removes a lot of stress for a lot of individuals once you get familiar with the program. Again, though, there's stress in dealing with it, not knowing how this works. So we're going to talk about it today. I want to just walk you through basically four major kind of screens or views that you would be using. The data view, the variable view, and then I want to talk about the output screen and then the syntax, what syntax is and what the syntax screen looks like. So let's start off with a very easy tour of the major two screens we're going to be using, the data view and the variable view. The data view displays essentially your data. So I've clicked on the data view tab on the bottom left hand side. It's turned yellow, which tells us we're on that view. We can see that on the left hand side we got numbers running up and down, kind of defining our different rows. These are the individual case numbers. So whatever you're examining, whether it's people, whether it's states, whether it's cities, whether it's criminal incidences, this defines which case number it is, which case, so case 16, case 15, case 14. These run all along the rows in the data view. On the columns, we have the individual variables for each one of these cases. So each column is a different variable that we're wanting to examine in this study. Going over to the variable view, if we click on the tab and it turns yellow, this is essentially an examination of the variables themselves, where the data view gives us the raw data where we actually physically enter the information for each variable for each individual case. The variable view tells us more about what those variables are and the characteristics of each of those variables. We have, going over here, 1 through however many variables you have, defining each variable. So in this case now, the variables have gone to being your individual rows. For each one of your variables in the variable view, we have a variety of different attributes or descriptions for that variable. Some of these are pretty common sense. Name, for example, is the name of the individual. Type is the type of data. Decimals are how many decimals are in each bit of information or each entry. The label is some type of label that helps us to understand what this variable is, so kind of a description. The values are the different attributes for each variable, so what does each value mean or translate into? If we're defining any missing values, so if we have missing information, the size of the columns, whether the data displays on the left, the right, or the center of the data view, and then what type of a measure it is, where it's nominal, ordinal, or interval ratio, and then what type of role it plays within our study. One of the best things to do to examine this is really just to look at some live data. So I have a couple different examples here. I have some example student data, which I'm going to double click and bring up to open the data set. So we have new data here. And this will allow us to actually walk over and examine what does this look like in a live data set. So first, let's start off with the data view. Here we can see with the data view, we have the cases on the left-hand side. In this case, we have 5 different students, Abby, Billy, Colt, Donna, and Earl. There are 4 different variables. So we have the variable of name, telling us what the name of each individual is. Gender, which is a series of numbers, zeros and ones. We have grade, which represents the grade that they got in the class. And then we have the hours that the student put in to this individual class or exam. So this is the raw information that we can enter in. We could add additional information in here. So if we wanted to enter a new student called Russ, whose gender was 0, who got a grade of 3, and spent 12 hours on the class, we could enter that information. So this is the screen you're going to spend a lot of time if you're doing data entry, entering the information into SPSS. Now, when we go to the variable view, we're going to examine what some of these variables mean. So once again, we have 4 variables now. They have become the rows within the variable view. So we have name, gender, grade, and hours again. So going over each one of these, once again, the type is the type of data that we're examining. Now, if we click in this box, or many of these boxes that have additional options that'll display, we click on the box, we get a little blue box on the right-hand edge. If we click on this, it's going to give us a menu where we can select a variety of options. So with the type of variable, this is the type of information that's being displayed. So for example, if we were using something that had scientific notation, if we were dealing with dates, dollar amounts, things of that nature, we could tell SPSS this is what the data is. So it can be aware of that. It also helps us some of the auto functions. So if it does auto calculation of dates from a particular point, you can run those types of, it'll automatically do some of those calculations or adjustments for you. There are 2 major types of variables or values that we're going to be using over the duration of this series. One are numeric, so when you have numbers that you're entering in, 1, 2, 100, 12,000. The other one is what we call a string variable. This is sometimes odd to people who aren't familiar with statistics research methods or SPSS. A string variable is simply alphanumeric characters, essentially. In this case, we have names entered in here: Abby, Billy, Colt, Donna, Earl, and now Russ. So the string variable, or defining a value or a variable as a string variable, tells SPSS essentially it's words. So it doesn't use it in numerical calculations, and it actually kind of acts as a bit of a safeguard, essentially, so we can't do things we shouldn't do with words. You can't add, subtract, multiply, or divide words. So the rest of these, gender, grade, and hours, are all defined as numeric. Now it's possible we could define gender as in actually writing in the word, but if we use a numeric representation for male or female, then we can actually do calculations based on those 2 types of groups, and that's something we want to do later on. So the width is the same for all of these. The decimals are the same for all of these. Basically, there's no additional decimals. If we wanted to add a couple decimals on, it would basically add on the additional zeros. But there's really no reason for us to be doing that in this data set. So we can set it back to 0, and it'll just give us the whole numbers. Labels are really important. The label is what you can enter in to essentially tell someone who's examining this data set what does this variable mean. So if we didn't know exactly what hours meant, if we are examining this data set and saw the variable hours and didn't know what it means, we can go to the variable label. In this case, we read the variable label and you see the number of hours the student studied. This tells us, all right, this value that's entered in for this particular variable for each case are the number of hours the student studied. Fantastic. This tells us something. It allows us to understand what that is. It's really important to keep good and descriptive labels, and they can be fairly long. Don't hesitate to make fairly descriptive labels. Now, the second one that's really important here to discuss are values. Values essentially allow us to define particular attributes about the variable. So, similar to type, if we click on here, click in the box, we're going to examine gender, and we get the little blue box option here. We get a pop out, and it tells us what the numbers mean. So in this case, we have -9, meaning unknown, -8, meaning the person refused to tell us in the survey or the instrument or whatever we're collecting data from. 0 equals female, and 1 equals male. Now in this case, gender is a dichotomous variable. It's yes or a no, or this or that. It only has 2 different values that it can take. Oftentimes with dichotomous variables, you want to code them 0 and 1. And for dichotomous variables, this gives us some special qualities. Essentially, because it's just this or that, it's none or whole. We can do some calculations such as filtering variables, which we'll talk about in a later podcast, or we can do some calculations such as calculating a mean. So if we take an average of zeros and ones, it'll basically calculate a decimal version of a percentile. So if we have 100 individuals, 60 of them are male, defined as 1, and 40 of them are female, defined as 0. If we do a calculation of that, an average, essentially, we'll get 0.6, telling us 60% of this sample is male. So once again, if you have a dichotomous variable, oftentimes you might want to put it in a 0 or 1 category. But these could have been defined as 1 or 2 or 73 and 69. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's simply the fact that there's a value that represents this or a numeric representation for that particular value or attribute for the variable. So once again, we have these odd -9 and -8. Now, oftentimes you might not see them in there. You might just leave missing data blank. If you don't know, you might just leave it blank. Some researchers, though, might actually put in a value to tell you, hey, we don't have this information. And in this case, this researcher told us why. It was either unknown from the instrument or the person refused to tell us. This information can be defined under the missing category. So if we know that there are particular attributes that, or particular values that we don't want calculated, we want the computer to essentially ignore, but we want to retain why that is, we can go to the missing and enter those values. As you can see, this research has put in -9 and -8 under discrete missing values. If we don't have any missing values, we could just click on no missing values and click OK. So we have columns here as well. This increases or decreases the size of the individual columns that are displayed on the data view. In this case, we can say name is as 8 spaces wide, gender is 6 spaces wide, and grade and hours are 4 spaces wide. We can also see the alignment, left, right, and center. Once again, we can go over to the data view and see where those are put in. This just allows you to present the data visually within the data view in a different way. This can help for sometimes data entry situations or things of that nature. We also have measure and roll. Essentially, the measure is one thing you might want to pay attention to, telling SPSS what type of data this is. Essentially, is it interval ratio data? That would be a scale. Is it ordinal data? Define it as ordinal. Or is it nominal and define it as nominal? So we have this information here, and there's a variety of other data sets that you can work with. I have some other examples up here. We have the federal sentencing data set. And this kind of is maybe a better representation of what an actual data set may look like. In this situation, we have thousands of cases, and this is actually an abbreviated version of the federal sentencing data set for 2006. I think it has about 72,000 cases ballpark in here, 72,585 cases. So this is actually a subsample of the federal sentencing data set. But we see there's a variety of information that's included in here, and the labels are what will tell us. So we have a unique identification number for each individual, and then a variety of definitions of variables: the citizenship of the individual, the individual's age, whether the race of the defendant, things of that nature it's going to tell us, and then how those are measured. Another thing we can do is we can actually bring in data from another software package or from other data forms. In this case, I have some information from some random information I pulled a while ago to do some statistical exercises from. This happens to be in Excel, so we can see we have a unique identifier, a Q1, Q2, a percentile score, and a total score. So in this type of situation, we could actually import this information into Excel. So in order to do that, we can go to File, Open, Data, and this will bring up, in this case I've already navigated to this particular folder where the data is. In this case we only see that student data and the federal sentencing data showing up, and that's because they're both SAV files. That's the save file, essentially the main file format for SPSS. In this situation, since we have an Excel file, we actually got to go down here and figure out where Excel is, or we can go to all files, and we see it pop up here. So if I double click on that, go ahead and open the file, it'll take us into an extracting wizard, essentially, to allow us to import that information from Excel into SPSS. So in this case, it's looking at the worksheet saying this is the worksheet you want to pull it for. We say yes. Also, sometimes it will read the variable information from the first row of the data. That's the way we have it defined. So we can click OK, and lo and behold, we get the data that we had in there. So we can now do our calculations from SPSS. Keep in mind, though, when we're examining this and we import this data, look at Q1 and Q2, and these were different responses that individuals gave. However, notice they're defined as string variables. This is because when SPSS pulled this information over, they saw they saw A, B, C, D, and even in a few situations, the word blank in here, and it said this is not numeric data, so it automatically defined it as string. So be aware, if a variable will not run when you import data, double check when the first things you want to examine are what type it's defined as. So let's go back to our data set dealing with the students. In this situation, we can talk about the two other screens. So we've talked about the data view and we've talked about the variable view. There's two other types of displays or things I want to talk about. The first one is the output screen, and those were examples that I just closed there by opening data sets. It opened a output screen. But let's run, let's say, an average for the number of hours. And we'll talk about this in a later video, but so we have 6 individuals here, and let's say we want to know what is the average number of hours that these 6 students ended up studying for this exam or course. So what we can do is we can actually go into this menu. There's a variety of different functions, computations, commands essentially that we can run. All of these allow us to do point and click, essentially go into these menus, find exactly what we want, and ask the computer to run that. So in this situation, again, we'll talk about this later, but let's just run an average for hours. So we can go into Analyze, we can go into Descriptive Statistics, and we can slide over here to Descriptives. When we click on this, it's going to give us a little pop-up menu. We'll get very familiar with these. And we can actually just grab number of hours and pull it over. And when we do that, it says it's going to do whatever we're asking it to do on this variable or these variables. I'm going to go into Options basically and just tell it all I want to do is run a mean. I click Continue and I say OK. So what this does now is we've asked the computer for information. We've said, I want you to look at this variable hours and I want you to calculate a mean for this variable. In this case, the computer's done it. SPSS has given us our answer, and it's displayed in what we call an output screen. Output screen is the third of these kind of different displays I wanted to talk about. This is when we ask for something and the computer is giving us the information back. SPSS is doing that command for us. So we asked for a mean, it gave us this information. We have the number of students, or oftentimes defined as n, so it's telling us there were 6 individuals. And we can look over there and confirm, yes, lo and behold, there were 6 individuals. And that the mean, or the average number of hours spent, and notice the number of hours the student studied, the variable label is carried over here. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to make sure that you define or give good labels and value labels. Variable labels and value labels. Make sure you manage these, manicure them, essentially, so that at the end of the day, they look good in output screens. It will help you immensely. So it tells us that the number of hours studied is 5.67. So we get this information, this calculation from the output screen. So we could do all sorts of other calculations. We could do all other such commands. And once again, you'll get these output screens when you open a file, when you close a file, when you shift a file, do any type of calculations. If you're editing variables or doing anything of that nature, oftentimes you'll get an output screen. And computer's essentially telling you what operation did it do. We can also see that up here under the where it says descriptive variables equal hours / statistics equals mean. This is that computer language. When we went up here and went to analyze descriptive statistics, descriptives, and actually inserted this information and ran it, this is essentially the computer language that got entered in to tell the program what we wanted it to do. So these menus essentially allow us to bypass the actual programming language that we would have to put in. We could, if we want, to put this raw information or this raw programming language in. In order to do that, we could go to File, Open, and then go down to what we call a syntax file. And this would actually allow us to, pardon me, I want to go to a new syntax file. And this would allow us to actually just enter this information in. So if I turn around and take this and copy and paste it directly into this syntax file, and we could type it up originally, and run this. I'm going to highlight it and click the green triangle to run. it gives us the same thing as going through the GUI, essentially, to enter that information or to make that request for a mean. So when you're running things, there are two different ways to do it. Most of the stuff we're going to do, we can do easily from the general interface. However, if you want to do advanced stuff, things of that nature, or you need to do a series of functions to multiple data sets, you could use the syntax. If you're ever curious and want to look at the syntax, whenever you run something, instead of just clicking OK and letting it do the command, you can click paste. And what it'll do is it'll actually open up a syntax file and tell you exactly what that command would be. And you could just click the triangle and it'll run it for you. So essentially we've been able to cover syntax, what it is, and what the syntax screens look like. We've covered the output screens and what they do for us. And we've also been able to talk about the two main display screens, the data view and the variable view. There's one other thing I want to just point out very quickly, and that is the options menu. Apple users, I believe it might be under File, but for Windows users, if you go to Edit and go down to Options, this will bring up a series of display options that you can use. Essentially, you could organize your variables instead of, you could use their names when in different lists, things of that nature, or you could display them by variables. You display in a variety of ways, alphabetical, by the file, the way they're pre-organized, by measurement level, things of that nature. Just be aware that all of these options are here if you ever need to go with them. Generally, other than asking for names, other than labels, I don't tinker around with it all that much. But once again, so this has been a very brief introduction to SPSS. Once again, we're using version 23, but most of these commands, most of this information should be applicable if you're using a different version. Thank you for watching, good luck, and keep asking questions.